Hello, this is Dr. Flight. I hope you're doing great today. This is a video lecture on single item and construct measures. So this is in marketing research, and what we're talking about is how we design the instrument or the questions that are going to measure different properties of our subjects or objects of interest. So to begin with, let's talk a little bit then about kind of this whole idea of what a subject is and what we want to think about in terms of what a measurement is, right? So as you can see, a measurement's a process of determining the amount of a property or a characteristic a subject possesses. That subject would be the subject of or the object of our investigation, and there's two basic things we want to think about. We want to think about and research what properties we're going to measure and how we're going to measure those properties. We'll look at a lot of different examples, but here's another kind of graphic or image that you could look at. And if we start at the far left, you'll see what would be our object or our subject that we're focusing on or we're trying to gather data on. So that'd be people, customers, other companies, a phenomenon of some type, something along those lines. So we're gathering data from these subjects, and what we want to do is we want to measure properties of those subjects. So in this case, it could be age if we look at properties, gender, brand preference, opinions, and things like that. Right? So these are the properties that the objects or the subjects possess, and we want to measure how much of these objects or some type of degree these objects possess. So then we have a question, and this whole lecture kind of talks about this idea of how these measures look and the measurement process. So the measurements then are the questions. How old are you? What is your gender? What's your favorite brand? How would you rate our brand? Those are all questions that would measure the properties that our subjects possess. And then, of course, we have our measurement results. Okay, so understanding the idea that we have objects or subjects that we're focusing on, that we measure properties as a result of them, and the idea that we have to create measures that measure those properties or that give us the accurate depiction of those properties is an important concept. So properties then are specific features or characteristics of an object that can be used to distinguish it from another object. We have a couple different ways to think about properties. Sometimes we think of them as objective, other times subjective. So when it's objective, and I'm just going to pull forward here, it's a concrete kind of concept, physically verifiable, things like age, gender, number of bottles purchased or number of items purchased, those types of things. We tend to ask these with single items on a survey, and they tend to be fairly easy for respondents to answer. They tend to be verifiable from a fact-based perspective. The other type of property that you could have is something that would be subjective, which would be abstract to some degree, or ones that you can't physically verify like in a countable way. So it cannot be directly observed because these are mental ideas or concepts, such as a person's attitude, opinion, or intention. So sometimes we can use a single item for these, but oftentimes we have to use something called a construct, which is a set of questions that measure this concept or this abstract property that we're trying to understand. Okay, typically again we use multiple questions to answer these. To give you some examples of this idea of concrete versus abstract in terms of properties, think of these. So from a consumer standpoint, we have some concrete properties like age, sex, marital status, income, brand, last purchased, and so on. And again, you can kind of see that those are properties that are verifiable and they're countable, and they're usually generally pretty easy to answer. Abstract properties, though, happen inside a person, oftentimes mentally, if you will. Attitudes towards a product, brand loyalty, involvement. So that's a concept of how active a person is in the process of buying or whatnot, emotions and so forth. Okay, so again, kind of compare and contrast concrete versus abstract properties. In an organization, concrete properties could be, again, descriptors of that property that are very objective. Name of the company, number of employees, number of locations, total assets. So these are all countable, observable, directly observable things. Indirectly observable properties, or other abstract ones for an organization, might be the competence or the ability of employees, quality control, channel power, competitive advantages, and so forth. And so, so again, remember, these are ones that you can't directly observe, and they're a little bit more difficult then, as a result, to measure. You have to measure them in a lot of different ways and not as in a straightforward manner. Okay, here's some more, and I'm not going to go through all this. I'd rather you pause the video and read through these, but we have, again, concrete and abstract properties for different elements or concepts in marketing, well, like brand loyalty. So if somebody's brand loyal, for instance, they'll buy the product often and they won't switch. So those are concrete things, like how often somebody buys, the volume they buy in, whether they have switched or not, or whether they're staying in our property, as a customer or not. It's kind of what makes sense. Now, abstract versions of that would be likes and dislikes, and this overall level of loyalty, which we can measure. Okay, so go ahead, take a look at these other marketing ideas, because this is marketing research. So these are qualities or features that we measure all the time, every day. Advertising recall for advertising and media spends, service quality, customer satisfaction, and so forth. Okay, so that should be that. So be sure you're comfortable with those ideas. And we're moving forward, so we'll talk a little bit for just a moment or two about this idea of a construct. I've mentioned this term a couple different times, and so it's worth kind of sitting here. We'll kind of spend a moment or two and then wrap this discussion up with this feature. A construct is an abstract idea, so we're using a construct to measure subjective or abstract elements or properties. Okay, when we measure them, they're not directly measurable, so we're inferring from the data we gather something about this idea or this construct. We usually use a series of questions. When we use a series of questions, we call that a scale. Okay, many different constructs exist in marketing. You just saw on the previous scale slide different abstract ways to measure some of the marketing ideas that we have. Those all might be things that we consider constructs. Okay, so again, some items or some properties are very easy to measure, and those are subjective. We use them with single items, age, gender, things like that. Other items, other properties, again, are very abstract, and you just can't measure them with a single item. So we have to use multiple questions that measure, at least in part, this concept. And when you take the questions together, we get a good reflection of the total abstract property. And so that's kind of the way it is. Now, developing scales and developing measurements for abstract or these types of objective or subjective properties is really difficult. It takes a lot of time, and there's a bunch of different steps to do it. But basically, the idea is we take an abstract concept and we use multiple measures. And again, individually, each measure will capture a little bit of the property, but it won't measure everything. So in this case, we have 3 different measures. Here's another example: price expectation. And, if we just asked my overall expectation of prices are, and then we have a scale like high to low or something like that, that would measure one part of price expectations. But then we have a couple other questions we'll add to it so that we sort of round out the measurement of this one abstract property. I expect prices to be, boom. Compared to other stores, the prices here at this one are most likely, again, high or low or something like that. Okay, so we're asking the respondent 3 different ways to describe their price expectancy. Now, you might say, well, these are all the same thing. We just keep asking over and over again. But it's not. In fact, when we get the data, we'll see people respond differently to each of these questions, all 3 of these questions. Now, they'll be answered in a similar fashion, but they won't be answered identically. And so this is where, again, you're measuring parts of price expectation with all 3 questions. If you were to eliminate one of these questions, you would not be measuring price expectation with as much fullness, with as much in its entirety. So we need all of them in order to measure this item. Okay, so again, this is kind of the way it works. These questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this illustration, they reflect the concept being created. So the idea that each question then explains some of the concept. If you eliminate some of the questions, then the measure that you get won't be as complete. You won't completely measure the concept as well as if you had them all together. Okay, so this is a very important idea just in general of how we measure complex ideas in research. Again, in marketing, there are literally thousands of constructs or scales that we use, and this is what we call it. We call it a scale when we have a set of these questions. So again, just kind of remember that a single construct here, one idea, if it's abstract, it's going to need a number of different questions in order to solve it. Now, again, I mentioned this idea that creating the scales are difficult. There's a big process involved with it. One thing we want to know is that the scales that we use measure the same thing every time, and that they can be used in lots of different contexts. Okay, so again, when we kind of come away from the idea of scales and constructs, the set of questions need to be consistent with each other together and consistent over time. So internal consistency is something that we kind of think about when we think about reliability. Like the questions go together. And if one of the questions doesn't go together, then it probably doesn't measure the construct particularly well, so we take it out. But also the scale, the set of questions should, if it's a good scale, they'll work over time after time after time in a lot of different populations and market segments. Okay, so that's a construct. Now let's walk through just a brief example of a construct and using one here where it might be helpful. So this is impulse buying tendency, IBT, and I've used this scale a number of times in research, where basically the idea is when we think about what is impulse buying tendency, and how would we measure it. So these are the questions that we would use. It's fun to buy spontaneously, and you'd either agree or disagree. So this would be a Likert-like scale. It's often fun to buy things without thinking. Sometimes I feel like buying things on the spur of the moment, and buy now, think later describes me. So again, these are 4 items. So this is a 4-item scale. You take each of these 4 items and you ask people like these, or you make these statements, and people either agree or disagree on a 5-point scale. And that's how you measure this. So that's the measurement device in order to measure. We use all 4 of these items, and together they measure impulse buying tendency. Okay, so in this example that I'll offer, we'll use a sample of 553 people with data that's being collected. And again, IBT, impulse buying tendency, is kind of described, as you can imagine, the tendency to buy spontaneously, unreflectively, immediately, and kinetically. It's also described as the behavior that is not regulated and that results from unplanned spontaneous impulses. It's also described as a sudden, often powerful, and persistent urge to buy something immediately. So that's the definition of the concept, and the 4 items that we're using should measure that definition. Okay, so again, when we develop scales, we have to define the concept very clearly, and then we have to create questions that reflect that concept. So that's what this scale does, those 4 items that we have. If we were to take some of this data, and we'll look at the data here in just a second, but as we go through this, we're interpreting, we gather the data, and the process that we typically do, and this is what we'll show in just a second, is we'll take the items, in this case there are 4 of them, and we'll average them together so that we get a single scale, single measure, or a single, what we call composite, for each respondent. So let me just pull that up and let me just give you a shadow here. So here we have respondent number 1, and we have 4 items, those 4 scale items that measure IBT, and you can go back and look at those again if you need to. And this is going to be on a 5-point scale, so from 1 to 5, 1 meaning does not describe me at all, or completely disagree, and 5 meaning this describes me completely and completely agree. Okay, so if you score a 5 or something close to 5, respondent 1 averages 4 out of these questions. So they answered the questions, and the average score, the composite score for respondent 1, is a 4. On a 5-point scale, that means that this respondent's pretty close to being impulsive. Impulsive buying tendency would be high for this individual. If we have other respondents, respondent 2 answered the same questions but scored a little bit lower. Respondent 3 even lower than that. Okay, now remember, there are over 300 respondents, so we would do this for everybody, right? The entire data set, every respondent is going to get a score or a global average here for each of these 4 questions. The very last respondent, 353, they're kind of high on the scale. They're 3.75. They're not as high as 1, but they're higher than 2 and 3 for sure. So respondent 3, you can imagine, is probably not impulsive hardly at all. They scored very low on this scale. Okay, but here's the point, that when we develop these scales, we know that collectively the 4 items reflect the construct. So assuming they do that, we're going to take an average of them to create one single score. And again, that's called a composite score, right? Now, one of the key things that's beneficial to doing this is that the data will actually do something. We'll do something called data reduction when we do this, because from moving forward in analysis, we will simply use the composite score as the score for impulse buying tendency in this research. So in other words, we're taking the 4 items and we're reducing them down to 1 item at the average for each of these respondents. So moving forward, we actually won't use all the original raw data. We'll use this new variable we created, the average IBT score, and that one global score will represent this abstract concept of impulse buying tendency. Okay, so this has been an introduction. I know constructs can be a little confusing in terms of how they're developed, but we use them a lot in research, especially in marketing, especially when we're trying to describe consumers. So it's well worth understanding and knowing what a construct is and how it all works. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.